All right, hello again, everyone, and thank you again for joining us for Backtesting, Measuring the Effectiveness of ALLL Methodologies. My name is Billy Burnett, and I'll be the host of today's presentation. Before we begin, just a couple of quick housekeeping items to go through. First, all attendees are in listen-only mode, so there's no need to worry about any background noise on your end. Second, we do accept questions throughout the day's broadcast. In order to do that, utilize the GoToWebinar panel on your screen as shown here on the slides. You'll also see on the slide that there is a link to download today's presentation slides. If for some reason that does not work for you, rest assured you'll receive an email later today with a link to these slides. Third, we will have few live interactive polls during today's broadcast, so we encourage and appreciate your participation in those. So again, I just wanted to give a quick overview of SageWorks for those on the call who might be unfamiliar. We are a financial information company providing credit and risk management solutions to well over 700 financial institutions across the country. We provide in-depth resources including white papers, webinars, videos, and templates available on our website, sageworksanalyst.com. I'd also like to introduce today's presenter. We're very lucky to have with us Mr. Reagan Camp. He's a senior risk management consultant here where he specializes in assisting financial institutions with the ALLL and stress testing. And prior to joining SageWorks, he was with Deloitte & Touche and consulting firm Dietrich & Associates. So at this time, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Camp to give us an overview of today's presentation. Reagan?
Perfect. Thank you, Billy, and appreciate Billy doing the moderating today, and certainly appreciate all of you who are on the call. We understand that in the various roles you serve at your different institutions, that you're busy individuals, and we appreciate you taking the time today to to indulge us for the next hour. And also to learn a little bit more about backtesting, and hopefully those things that we're able to present to you today can be of benefit. I would highly encourage you, as Billy mentioned, if you have any questions throughout anything that I go over, if there's something that's unclear, if you want further clarification, if you just have something completely unrelated, that from something I may present, but something curious and related to backtesting in general, please feel free to submit those questions. Either during this the interactive question and answer period here today, or I believe that I'll have some contact information at the end slide. Please feel free to utilize us at SageWorks and reach out to us with any questions you may have. Our intent is to be educational, to be the forefront of thought leadership and education, and would love the opportunity to assist you in any way that we can. With that being said, let's just let's set the ground for what we're going to be talking about today. You should be seeing on your screen the different learning objectives that we'll try to accomplish today. First, we want to discuss model risk. The reason being is when we're talking about backtesting, it's important to understand backtesting's, the cause and effect of backtesting as it relates to model risk. Ultimately, all of us are engaged in utilization of various models, including the calculation of our ALLL, whether it be Excel, whether it be a third-party solution or whatever else it might be. We want to address model risk, the different inherent risks associated with that, and the role that backtesting plays in mitigating those risks. Second, we want to talk about backtesting in general. What is backtesting? Understanding that there are individuals on this call who may be experts in backtesting, while also understanding that some of you, may know the name, or maybe this is the first time you've ever heard the word. We want to start basic and build up so that we can accommodate or tailor to all of those different listeners today. Third, we want to talk about, as it relates to backtesting, basically starting from a general overview at a portfolio level, as well as diving more specifically into specific segmentations of our ALLL, and utilizing and providing different examples of ways in which we might backtest in those different instances. And then finally, what we'll do is we'll kind of bring everything back around, highlight, everything that we told you. So in essence, hopefully my third grade English teacher is proud of me. I'm going to tell you here what I'm going to tell you. I'll tell you, and then at the end I'll tell you what I told you. Before we jump into that, what I'd like to do is we'd like to start with a poll question just to get a gauge as far as who our listeners are, what your experience is in backtesting, etc. So I'd like to turn the time back over real briefly to Billy to conduct our first poll and encourage your participation in that. So Billy.
Great, thanks Reagan. With that being said, you should all be seeing the first poll question up on your screen now. How often do you backtest your ALLL methodology? So we've got monthly, quarterly, annually, and never. So we'll take just 20 seconds or so to allow you a chance to enter in so we can better gauge the audience on the call. So it looks like we've got almost 75% have voted, so we'll leave it open for just 5 more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close today's poll, and we'll go ahead and show the results. So Reagan, can you see the results there? It looks like we've got majority have never backtested, and next highest would be annually and then quarterly.
Perfect. All right. So first off, thank you everybody for participating in that poll. It definitely provides me some basis as to the audience that we're speaking to. So with that being said, where a majority of us are either not doing it or just doing it on an annual basis, what I'd like to do is I would like to start pretty basic. So as we go through, keep that in mind. If you have more specific questions, after it, again, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. Let's go ahead and what you should be showing, or let me click into it. So we should be seeing a screen that says model risk. Billy, speak up if not. Starting with model risk. So let's just start with a basic definition of what model risk is. So model risk by definition is the potential for adverse consequences from decisions based on incorrect or misused model outputs and reports. So basically, it is the risk inherent in any model that we use. So models by their inherent nature are simplifications of the real world. So we're utilizing a model to predict an ALLL, to predict future losses or whatever the model may be. The model risk is that risk inherent in doing so. Either having a model that is misused or a model that is just inherently flawed in its nature. Now, the reason we bring up model risk is it poses a significant risk to a bank if not appropriately mitigated and monitored. It could do anything from lead to financial loss, which obviously is a bad thing. It can affect our business and strategic decision making and result in poor decision making. On the flip side, it could also damage a bank's reputation. So everybody on the call understands that as far as going through the, it takes a lifetime really to build a reputation, and at least, and it's something that you're constantly day in and day out trying to, fortify and build up. It doesn't take too long to break that reputation or to minimize it. So we're going to talk about ways in which we can mitigate this risk so that we don't lose credibility with customers, with board members, or whoever might be reviewing our ALLL, as well as auditors and examiners alike. If we're showing that we're making a conscious effort to do the best we can by way of monitoring these inherent risks, it builds that reputation and it helps us with the examiners alike. Now, primary reasons for the occurrence of model risk. First, the model may have just fundamental errors that may produce inaccurate outputs when viewed against things like the design objective or the intended business use. You see that the mathematical calculation and the quantification exercise underlying any model generally involves things like application of theory, choice of sample design, numerical routines, selection of inputs and estimations, as well as implementations of information systems. Now, along those lines, errors can occur at any point from design all the way through implementation. So we want to look and make sure that the quality of the model output is such that we're not, that we're relying on our ability to utilize the model, and that's going to determine the output. We don't have this, inherently flawed model that we're trying to work with. Now, the second reason, or the second primary cause of model risk, lies in the fact that the model may be used incorrectly or inappropriately. So even if we have a fundamentally sound model producing accurate outputs, consistent with whatever our design objective was of the model, we may still have a model that produces or has the inherent potential of misapplying or misusing that data if we don't closely monitor it. So one, we have the threat of the model being inherently flawed. Two, we have the threat of misusing that model inappropriately or incorrectly. Now, how do we combat that? I like the way that the OCC puts it. In their April 2011 supervisory guidance on model risk management, this is what they say. They say even with skilled modeling and robust validation, model risk cannot be eliminated. So other tools should be used to manage model risk effectively. Among these are establishing limits on model use, monitoring model performance, adjusting or revising models over time, and supplementing model results with other analysis and information. So what I want to focus on are these few lines that you see highlighted and underlined in here. So one of the ways that we combat model risk is by monitoring the model performance over time and adjusting or revising that model as we recognize flaws or inherent flaws, or as we recognize needed adjustments. So that's really where the reason we start here is that's really the purpose of backtesting, is to help us to monitor model performance and to adjust and be able to adjust to those necessary revisions over time in order to enable us to combat model risk. So with that being said, what is backtesting? What we're all here for. First, just in correlation with that previous slide, just jump to that second bullet point that you see there. Backtesting is a form of outcome analysis, critical to managing model risk. So we just touched on that, right? So it's a way that we are able to analyze what our model is outputting in order to make critical decisions in managing model risk. Now back to the first bullet point, really a definition. Backtesting is an exercise that compares the actual outcome with model forecasts during a defined period, and also a period of time that's generally not used to develop the methodology. So in other words, as we're discussing the ALLL, we're basically saying our ALLL model projects that we need this. Now let's compare this required reserve that we've projected or calculated to what we actually ended up needing, so to the actual outcome. So we're doing prediction versus actual in order to test those in correspondence with each other. Now third, what backtesting is that it's an exercise that enables us to monitor model performance and adjust or revise the model over time. Now this ties in with with that second bullet point of managing model risk. It enables us, as we do backtesting, we're able to recognize maybe inherent flaws in our model, maybe different ways in which we misapply data, maybe subjective approaches that the model affords us. Maybe there's efficiencies that we can gain there. That's really what backtesting allows us to do, is allows us to test those things and make adjustments accordingly. Now, the backtesting objective. So for the purpose of the ALLL, the objective is to ensure that the ALLL methodology is accurate in measuring the losses inherent in a bank's portfolio over the subsequent 12 months. Now, I understand that a lot of us are anxious about we hear the buzz of FASB's forthcoming changes, this CECL model, current expected credit loss model, life of loan model, whatever you want to call it. People are anxious to, and they're starting to look forward to that. Well, the reality is we're currently still subjected, whether we like it or not, to the incurred loss model. So what we're looking at today is I want to look at, over the next 12 months, what the inherent losses are in our portfolio, and I want to test to that. Now, I make a note on the screen that we understand, too, that the FASB's proposals are a serious threat to overhauling the whole ALLL calculation in its entirety. So with that being said, what we're learning today, it doesn't become null and void. It's just simply going to adapt. So we're going to continue to use backtesting, where I would assume that we would, and it would be prudent to, but it will, and it'll continue in some fashion, but it will require some adjustment. For example, instead of looking over what's going to happen over the next 12 months, now when we move to life of loan concepts and those take hold, we're going to start looking at longer time horizons. or maybe we are back testing at different intervals, along that life of loan in order to make sure that we're pointed in the right direction and that we don't get too far off track. So we're not going to speak a lot to FASB CECL. I'll mention it a couple times throughout the presentation, but keep in mind what we're talking about today is the incurred loss model and testing to that. Now, ALLL back testing at the portfolio level. We're going to start here because one of the simplest levels that we can backtest on is backtesting the ALLL on a global level, where we're comparing the institution's ALLL to its realized losses over a period of time. So what we see on the screen is an example of that. In this example, the institution is looking at its ALLL and comparing that amount with annualized net charge-offs year to date, or in other words, an approximation of a full year's charge-offs. Now, when we talk about annualized charge-offs, it doesn't look like I have a, oh, there we go. I don't know if you guys can see my pointer. If not, if so, you can imagine with me. But you'll see the annualized charge-offs. I want to make sure that you understand what I'm talking about here. So, for example, if we're looking at a quarterly period end date, so we're looking at that first quarter 2013 as an example here, you'll notice that we have a projected ALLL or a calculated ALLL of $10.9 million. Now, with that being said, when we look at this, we see actual charge-offs to date, and the actual charge-offs to date are $219,000, or a negative $219,000. If we were to take that and we were to annualize it, because we're looking at just one quarter's actual experience, we're going to multiply that by 4 to get us to the 876. And the same thing with any of these others, with the exception of our 630. Now we have 2 periods of actual experience. We're just going to multiply it by 2 to get to our full annualized experience. And then everything up to this 1231, you'll notice that the actual is the same as the annualized because we're capturing a full year-to-date experience. So I want to make sure that we make that clear when we're talking about annualized net charge-offs, because that's an important component to it. Now, the comparison that we're seeing assesses the coverage of the ALLL relative to the realized losses. So, in this analysis, the institution can ask itself a couple different things, and we'll toggle back and forth between the 2 screens. The first thing that I would ask myself, if I set it up similar to what we just saw, is how many years of losses can be estimated to be covered by any period end allowance when examining the current period allowance as compared to net charge-offs years to date, and of course annualized. So we come back here. In this specific example, you can see that the bank calculated ALLL exceeded the realized net charge-offs consistently by approximately 25%. So you can see that in here as far as that's concerned. So, so they're doing okay. In 2012, specifically, you'll see that it would appear that overall the bank had approximately 150% coverage of the realized losses based on the ALLL that was reported in each quarter. So we're able to look and say, okay, let's project, let's see what's actually happening versus what we projected was happening in order to create this this estimation or the percent difference, as you see in there in the 4th column. How close were we to what we were doing, and we could make adjustments or decisions based off of that. Now, second, does the current period's net charge-offs year to date annualized exceed the prior period's allowance? Now, this one takes question 1 a little bit farther. So if there are periods in which annualized net charge-offs exceed the prior period's allowance, then it's really important to dig more into what the reasons were for those charge-offs to increase and where it could have been identified in the ALLL. Now, this is going to require a little bit more in-depth review of the different particular segments that we're going to look at in just a minute. When I say segments, I'm talking about your ASC 450 or FAS 5 pools. And specifically what we're going to look at in those specific segments is segment size, growth, loss rates, qualitative factors, so all of these individual components that may have contributed to these changes. Now, question 3 that we see on here. Were there significant changes from one quarter to the next in the net charge-offs? If so, did the allowance increase accordingly? Now, a couple other questions that I don't actually have on the screen but kind of carries this along is if the ALLL didn't increase, what factors could have been identified that could be watched more closely in the future to increase the ALLL accordingly. So we're asking ourselves all these questions along the way in order to say, here's the performance, here's what the data is showing us. Through our back test, let's ask these different questions and let's react accordingly as far as adjusting our model, adjusting our assumptions, etc. So this question number 3, this is similar to question 2 that you see up above. Again, requires a more in-depth review of the various FAS 5 ASC 450 segments to determine which segments had an increase in charge-offs that would have ideally led to an increase ultimately in the required reserve. Now, when we talk about, so there's questions we looked at from an overarching standpoint, quite simple. Let me go back to that slide. Quite simply, what were our charge-offs in comparison to what we anticipated we need to hold? And then we've asked a couple more questions, question 2 and 3 here, that require a little bit deeper analysis. So let's look at that. On the specific portfolio segments, first it's important to determine answers to several questions from period to period, so whatever those periods may be. So whether we're looking at it monthly, quarterly, annually, etc. First, and you'll notice those on the screen here, which segment had an increase in the FAS 5 reserve? 2, how much of the increase is due to changes in the volume of that portfolio? And then on the flip side, how much is due to changes in the loss rates? For us, sometimes we can say, okay, we'll look at cause and effect. We'll say, well, it changed. Well, it's just because the loss rate went up. Well, maybe. It may have something more to do with the volume than it actually does the change in the loss rates. So that's why I'm showing this example that we see on the screen here. So this particular example, what it does is it analyzes the change in balance as compared to the change in loss rates from one quarter to the next. And what it does is it analyzes the impact on the reserve. So as an example, what we're seeing is a significant effect on the reserve from the change in loss rates for residential real estate and commercial real estate, particularly with the loss rate. So as we're looking at it, so as an example, you'll see over here the rate effect on reserve. What we're saying is you see there's a significant impact here, $300,000 for CRE, and a significant impact on residential real estate. So we see an impact of a negative 580, so basically a reduction of 585,000. Now we can look and we can say, well, what's that attributed to? Well, in this case, there's a lot that's attributed to the rate. What we see is, as an example, as of 6/30, we have an adjusted historical loss of 0.77% for 6/30, but that dropped to 0.75 for 9/30. Well, that doesn't seem like it would have a big effect because we're only dropping by basically 2 basis points. But what's happening is you'll notice that when this particular pool is $1.5 billion in size. So with that being said, that could just a minute drop in adjusted reserve percentage could have a significant impact, which it does, a reduction of $300,000. Now the same thing down here, a little bit more dramatic. The adjusted reserve is 0.96% as of 6/30. It drops to 0.78 as of 9/30. Not as big of a balance, but still a large resulting effect on the reserve. So that's what we're talking about there. Now on the flip side, with additional changes, so other things, if you're looking at like the volume or the effect on the reserve of the volume. Now you'll notice here that we've got large changes in the commercial and CRE pools. Well, if you look at an example of the commercial pool, the adjusted historical loss doesn't change any. So what that tells me is that 100% of the change in required reserve from 6/30 to 9/30 is attributed to this change in balance. So we can't just say, well, the reason that we were off or the reason we had a change or whatever it might be that you're looking for is due to the loss rate or change in the loss rates. Well, sometimes it might not be. Sometimes it's due to the change in volumes. So it's important to isolate, where it comes into play, if it's volume or if it's loss rate, so that you can then take it the next step further when we're going to testing. All right. So after identifying some of the reserve changes, so if we identify that it's due to loss rate changes, the institution now needs to analyze, how much of the effect is due to a change in the actual historical loss rate as opposed to the qualitative factors. So you'll notice on this last screen that I was on, you'll notice that it says adjusted reserve. So when we talk about these loss percentages, the adjusted historical loss rate is comprised of two components, my historical loss rate and my qualitative factor. So what we need to do is we need to separate those out, and we're going to dig down even further. So if we say, well, it's not due to volume, it's due to a majority to the adjusted reserve, let's take a look at that. So I'm going to go down, and we'll look at this screen here. So in this particular instance, when we look at the historical loss rate component, the institution needs to examine the timing of charge-offs that rolled out of the loss rate as compared to charge-offs that may have entered with the most recent quarter. So these changes, the thing about them is they can be anticipated or projected, so it makes it really important for us to examine this closely ahead of time. So as an example, you'll see on the screen here an example that I've provided. Now it's going to be a real simplified example, but in this particular case, let's say that the institution is using 4 quarters of loss rates through 9/30/2013. Okay, if we did that, 4 quarters loss rates through 9/30/2013, the loss rate is going to drop significantly as opposed to if we did it through 6/30/2013, since the quarter that that additional quarter that we would be picking up in 9/30 is significantly less than the quarter that's dropping off. So let me explain that further. If I was to look at this, so let's say that I'm doing these 4 quarters right here in my analysis, you'll notice that we've got a pretty big collection of charge-offs here. Well, what happens when we do our next calculation? We move forward a quarter and we pick up these 4 quarters instead. Well, because this quarter that we're picking up is significantly lower than this quarter that we just dropped off, we're going to see a change in that particular loss rate. So again, all we're trying to do is we've looked at it from an overall perspective. We've then dropped into particular segments. We're now looking at an example CRE portfolio, and we're saying, okay, when we looked at that portfolio or the CRE segment, we look at that CRE segment and we say, okay, we understand that it looks like the change in our ALLL is inherent or is associated with the change in historical loss rate. Well, let's look in and let's figure out why. Well, we can see in here, well, when we moved from one period to the next, there was a significant drop-off. Okay, now we understand the picture a little bit better as to why those changes happen by being able to look at the actual experience of what was going on. Now, keep in mind that if we're using migration analysis, so for those of you who don't use migration analysis, this may be a foreign language to you, so you can tune out for a minute if you haven't already. But the migration analysis, let's say that an institution is using it, it's important to compare not only the numerator but also the denominator of the loss rate for each segment and subsegment in that respect, because this will help to indicate that whether the deterioration of a portfolio led to higher loss rates in one subsegment over another. So for example, let's say that if the loss rate is now higher for substandard, we know that this is either because of one, the source historical period, the volume of substandard loans is lower, so our denominator has changed, or 2, the level of charge-offs attributable to substandard loans is now higher. Okay, so we're looking at either the numerator, our net losses, or our denominator, the average balance of loans, and we know that one of those must have changed if we see a change in rate. So we're going to look and say, well, what was it? These types of differences can be discovered by a report similar to the one that you're seeing on the screen. In this example that you see, again, pretty simplified example, we're using an 8-quarter migration period starting in September of 2011, as well as in June of 2011, for measuring loss rates for 2 years forward, or second quarter 2013, third quarter 2013. Now, the loss rate for pass-rated loans in the CRE portfolio has decreased fairly significantly. This, it appears, is due to some charge-offs dropping out of the migration period used during this time period. So you look at it, we can say, okay, so we've got a loss rate of for 6/30 of 0.5164%, it drops to 0.2798%. Well, there's not a real significant change in the balance or the denominator of the pool. However, there is a pretty significant change in the net charge-offs from one period to the next being picked up. So again, we're doing this testing in order to look and say, let's isolate where those, what's attributing to those changes, and we can see here it's due to those, to the losses. Now, let's look on a different example. I mentioned we need to look at the numerator, which in this case was the effect, but also the denominator. So we look at special mention, it's a different picture. So special mention, we see net charge-offs of 197 and net charge-offs of 197 in the 630 and 930 period. But yet we see a pretty significant increase. We go from 1.15% up to 1.40%. Well, we've isolated by doing this testing and drilling down further. We've said, okay, it's not due to the numerator, it's actually due to the denominator. So we're looking at, we drop from $17,000 to $14,000. Consequently, with a lower denominator and an equal numerator, we have a higher loss rate. So, here's an example of that. So, what you can do is, and I don't have a screen for this, but if these ratios that we're bringing up were plugged into a table similar to that specific segment table that we looked at before up here, the bank could they could then carry these ratios forward to see the effect on the reserve for that portfolio segment. So as far as what effect, the information that we've discovered here, what that would have going forward if we applied any type of change. Alrighty, now qualitative factors. So we've talked about from a quantitative measure ways that we can dig down into the portfolio. We can use actual experience, compare that to what was projected. We can identify where the individual components as to what drove the calculation to do what it did, and we can make decisions off of that. We can forecast off of that. The one component that we didn't look at yet is the qualitative factors. Now this is an area that is real easy to manipulate because it's inherently subjected by nature. So one thing that I point out on here is a bank should look closely at the change in qualitative factors over time and compare the direction of change to the direction of change of any applicable metrics for that specific factor. So, we've all heard this before, directional consistency, directional consistency. We want to make sure that we're directionally consistent in those factors, but also this is where when we mentioned model risk, we mentioned that two primary components of model risk is one, there's a flaw in the model, so by way of calculation or something like that, or we're misusing the model. Well, this is an area that may be isolated to the latter, where maybe our assumptions are not in accordance with what actually happened. So this could drive us pretty far off. So let's take a look at that. And let's look at an example. So one thing that's nice is what if I was to lay out all of my qualitative factors. So for example, you see the different pools here. So in this case, we're segmenting by call code. So my first pool is my 1 to 4 family residential constructions, second 1A2 and so on. What I'm doing is I'm listing my 9 factors in this case. So we're using just the 9 that were recommended in the interagency policy statement. And we're then taking that and we're saying let's look at what has happened over the past X number of months, X number of quarters, X number of years to the movement in our qualitative factors. Now in here you see that there's a monthly in this case we're doing a monthly calculation and monthly adjustments. Now with that being said, as we look at this, you'll notice that as of 6/30 we see certain adjustments totaling 0.44%. And then as we go to 7/31, it goes to 0.36%, and we're really looking at each of the individual components, but then you see that we stay constant over time. Well, what this picture tells me is that if I'm looking back at this and I am comparing this to the underlying factors or drivers behind each of these, what this is telling me is that the economy and all of these factors remain steady basically from 7/31 all the way through 11/30. So I have to ask myself, did that really happen? Are we doing an adequate job of mirroring that directional consistency or mirroring the movement of the underlying factors? So let me take that a step further to hopefully explain that a little bit further. The first one, changes in international, regional, and local conditions. Some of the possible drivers or metrics behind this may be changes in unemployment rate, changes in GDP growth. Could be changes in these things at the state level, the national level, the local level, etc. Taking a simplified example, let's say that we're just looking at our state unemployment. Okay, that is what we've identified, what we've outlined in our policy as being the key driver behind these changes. What this is telling me is that we have not seen any change in unemployment over time, at least through this time period that we're looking at. We now test that as we're back testing, we're able to look at that and say, did we do an adequate job of mirroring that unemployment rate movement? And if so, great. If not, we would want to look at that a little bit closer. So by setting up a table similar to what you're seeing here, this provides, I think, a pretty good example of being able to look at, have I been directionally consistent with the underlying factors? And if I have been, great. If not, I have potential. It's very likely that those external factors, these qualitative factors, well, so internal and external, but these qualitative factors are probably having an impact on my actual experience, but I'm not now incorporating those into my projected experience. So that's where, again, backtesting, we're trying to say, how did actual correlate with projected? Well, if our qualitative factors, if these outside influences and internal influences are having an effect on the losses or the inherent risk of our portfolio, it's happening in the actual, but we're not appropriately accounting for here. Those are the types of things that we're looking for. Now, realized charge-offs versus historical loss rates. Backtesting of realized charge-offs as compared to the adjusted historical loss rate also needs to be completed. Okay, this requires us looking at a adjusted historical loss rate as of a particular point or set point in time, and then examining the amount of net charge-offs over the subsequent 12 months. So as an example, you'll see it up here. You see that the loss rates of the C&I pool is probably a good example. So we had, as of 9/30, we had an expected adjusted or historical loss rate. So again, adjusted historical. So this is actual losses or historical losses, the quantitative portion plus the qualitative portion. We have a loss rate of 1.5% that we projected on a balance of loans of $10 million. So consequently, as of 9/30/2012, we set aside a reserve of $150,000. Now, move forward a year, we now have the hindsight of what actually happened, and we say, well, we actually only experienced charge-offs of $100,000. So we now utilize that information, this ALLL coverage of 1.5%, in order to, it's telling, right? So we're back testing and we're comparing, here's what we projected would happen a year ago for the next 12 months. Here's what actually happened. And let's now see, do we need to make adjustments for that? So similar questions, in here, that we may ask ourselves. So similar to what we asked at the global level, questions we might ask when we do this type of testing that I just showed you is, to what degree did the ALLL cover the net charge-offs over the subsequent 12 months? Well, in that case I just showed you, it's 150%, right? So we're more than covered. Okay, well, if we're going to be wrong, then it's probably better to err on that side. Now, the other thing we might ask ourselves is, did the current, and let me go back to here, did the current period's annualized or subsequent 12-month charge-offs exceed the ALLL? If so, what did we miss? So an example, a good example is in here. So we look at CRE. So we projected the losses to be 1.25%, or in other words, we reserved for 62,500. What actually happened was 70,000. So we only had coverage of 89% of that. Obviously, that presents an issue. So we're asking ourselves, well, what did we miss? Where were we wrong? If we missed it, was it due to increases in delinquency? Was it due to changes in the local economy or other factors? So all of this testing that we've been going through, and how I was showing you that you drill down through your portfolio, this is what we're doing. So you almost even start with this screen and say, okay, was it adequate? Okay, it wasn't adequate. Well, why not? where did, what caused us to arrive at the assumptions that we arrived at? What other factors could have helped in identifying a change in the qualitative factors that may have allowed us to have adequate coverage of ensuing charge-offs? So here's an example where, maybe we missed in this 1.25%, maybe we missed a qualitative movement. Again, maybe we stayed consistent with our adjustments from one period to the next, when in reality, unemployment rate was moving. We didn't account for that increased risk. That increased risk resulted in additional charge-offs or actual recognized charge-offs. Did we miss something? So again, a big reason why we're back testing. Alrighty, so let's talk about challenges to back testing. The biggest challenge that we find is the data. Do I have sufficient data to back test? You'll notice in all of the examples that I showed you, you'll have access to these slides after the call, so you'll be able to view the different. You could even replicate some of these on your site if you want to. But do I have sufficient data? A lot of times, in order to back test, what we need is the hindsight. Well, in order to have hindsight, we need to have historical data. So if you aren't currently archiving data in a data warehouse, in a third-party solution, in some other source of database archive, you might want to start doing it in order to effectively back test. The bigger the sample size, the more data we have accessible to us, the easier it's going to be for us to back test. In addition to that, just having data isn't always enough. If I need to come up with money, it's great if I have a high net worth. It's not good if I need to make this big payment and all of my information or all of my net worth is tied up in illiquid assets, right? So the same type of idea is how accessible, how malleable is the archived data. So we want to make sure that it's accessible, that, for example, is it just captured in PDF documents that we then have to transpose from one source into something that's actually workable, or is it archived in Excel spreadsheets? Is it archived in a database that we could generate a query into an Excel spreadsheet or somewhere that we can have access to that data? Are we in a third-party solution that provides us that ability, where they're archiving the data, they're hosting the data, and making that accessible to us to where we can do what we want with it? So one, make sure we have sufficient data, and if we don't, start capturing it. Two, make sure that we're cognizant of how accessible that data is going to be in the event that we need to use it. Okay. Now, FASB CECL. I mentioned that we wouldn't talk a lot about it. The reality is that while CECL is certainly going to be changing certain aspects of the ALLL methodology, much of the sample back tests that we described today are going to continue to be applicable, in my opinion. The main change is just going to be the time horizon considered. So, for example, in the last example, the institution may use a longer time horizon than 12 months in light of the life of loan concept. So, there's a lot of different ways that you can still utilize the concepts that we talked about today, some of the examples we talked about today in FASB's. And also, I will put an asterisk on that and tell you, quite frankly, we don't know what the final proposal is going to be. We don't know what's going to be implemented. We don't know to what degree it's going to change. So I wouldn't sit back. We have a lot of institutions we talk to that sit back and say, well, I'm just going to wait to see what happens before I start, or I know that a change is coming, so I'm just going to kind of sit on my hands and just wait for that change to happen before I start implementing our back testing procedures. I caution you from doing that. We don't know when it's going to come out. We don't know if it's going to come out. We don't know what the result is going to be. So implement something today and then just simply adjust as the time comes would be our recommendation on that. But some of those challenges. Now, I highlight some challenges in here. We want to present a poll to you of what challenges are you experiencing? What do you think is the biggest challenge for back testing? So what I want to do is I actually want to turn it back over to Billy and let Billy run our second poll. And again, encourage your participation in this poll to see what your biggest challenges are. So Billy?
Thanks, Reagan. The poll question should be up on your screen now. What is the primary challenge that prevents you from backtesting your ALLL methodology? So you see the results up there. You see the choices. Over 45% of you earlier had indicated that you don't backtest currently. So this should provide some good insight for us to see, kind of what is the primary challenge here. So we've got just over 50% of you have voted so far, so we're going to leave it open for just a few more seconds. All right, I'll give it 3 more seconds, and then we'll close it down and show the results. All right, so looking at the results, it's pretty split between time constraints and just confusion on how to actually do it. Reagan, it looks like 32% for time constraints and 31% not sure how to do it, and then 12% for not having enough data or data is not easily accessible. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's consistent with that first poll, certainly, where we had, I think it was 45% who said we've never done it. That makes sense. Maybe it's a cause and effect, either way. Either we don't know how to do it, so we haven't done it, or we haven't done it, so consequently we don't know how to do it, right? And obviously time constraints is a big thing, where we've gone through, as we get through some of these troubling years, hopefully we're on our way out. It seems like the numbers are saying that we are. Hopefully, cross our fingers, we continue that way. Hopefully at that point we don't have to be as lean as banks have had to be, where they've hunkered down. Hopefully you have additional resources that allow you to do this. And of course there's other options out there. One is, if you've got the data, if it's easily accessible, it can make, the time requirement, it can reduce that time requirement. On the flip side, there's also, other opportunities by way of third-party solutions and things that are out there that help to automate this for you. So even better, it helps to eliminate that. It makes you more efficient so that you can, so for those of you who just have time constraints, you may look to some of those models. You may look to, outside sources to help you with that. As far as those that don't know how to do it, hopefully, I know that, it's difficult in where you don't have the feedback from individuals to answer every question they may have. We'd be happy again to answer any questions you might have so that we can teach you how to do that. We have a lot of different resources. Please utilize, try to digest the slides that we provided you today, or that will be provided if you haven't seen them already. If you need a recording of this, that may be made available to you. If you have, there's other documentation that we've put out by way of white papers and things of that nature that you can reference. There's a lot of resources out there to help you to understand how to do it. But the biggest key is for us to simply identify, here's what our projection is, here's what actually happened. Let's identify why we missed the mark if in fact we did. Let's drill down into these different components, and I gave you some examples today to do that in order to help us. So just start small. Start small from an overall standpoint, and then as you educate yourself, there's opportunities to grow with that. Now, appreciate the feedback on that. Just as a conclusion to what we've talked about today before we jump into a Q&A session, back testing in and of itself is a form of outcome analysis that's critical to managing model risk. So with model risk, either one, there's an inherent flaw in our model, or our methodology, or whatever it is that we're using to calculate our ALLL, or two, we're misusing it. Back testing is that outcome analysis that allows us to identify, one or both of those being the issue, and if they are, it allows us to investigate it further. Second, back testing enables you to monitor model performance and adjust or revise the model over time. I can't emphasize that latter part of that sentence enough. A lot of times people will recognize that there's an issue, but they don't take the necessary steps, or they don't know how to take the necessary steps to revise it. Well, once we recognize an issue, we need to revise it. We need to make sure that we do that and then test again. So maybe you go back in time and you say, well, what if we had done this? How would that have affected our our actual outcome? How would that have compared? Third, back testing is growing as a useful way to defend the bank's methodology and the various assumptions that are employed in implementing your ALLL methodology. the reality is that many banks and credit unions still don't employ a backtesting plan with their ALLL methodology. And that's evidenced today, where 45% have never done it. Now, that's not to be a criticism to those institutions in any way. We've revealed that some just simply don't have the resources to do it. Others just simply, they just don't have the education to do it, and they're focused on other things, or they don't know where to turn. Today is a terrific movement towards that, and I applaud those of you who are coming here who are proactively trying to get that education so that you can do it. But my point is that because so many banks are not doing it, banks that do proactively employ backtesting are ahead of their peers in the eyes of the examiners. I spent time representing the FDIC while I was with Deloitte. I have the exposure on that side of the world from the examination side. I understand the examiner's mindsets. If they see that you are taking a proactive approach to trying to shore up your model and you're constantly adjusting it and so on, you're definitely going to be light years ahead of your peers, and it's terrific from a performance rating standpoint. So anyway, please utilize us as a resource. If you have any additional questions on backtesting, which I'm sure you will, please reach out to me specifically, and I'd be happy to answer those. Now, moving on, kind of changing the topic, just want to highlight while we have everybody on this that we do have a 3rd annual Risk Management Summit that's coming up again in Nashville, Tennessee. For those of you, and that's on September 24th through the 26th. For those of you who were at our first year, or who experienced our first Risk Management Summit, I think you came away with a tremendous insight from some of the industry experts. If you then came back in year 2, you understood that we really even stepped it up several notches. Received terrific rave reviews as far as the quality of content that's there, and the quality of speakers that were there, as well as the venue itself. Well, what we've decided to do in this 3rd year is take it even farther. I am super excited for this. The speakers will be bigger. The speakers will be better. Some of us literally will be bigger. You'll have the opportunity we'll be right in the heart of downtown Nashville, and it's going to be covering all topics, ALLL, stress testing. We'll talk about the forthcoming FASB changes. We'll talk about back testing in detail. You'll have an opportunity to network with your peers and so on. So if you're interested, more information, we'd encourage you to save the date and look at web.sageworks.com/summit to learn more information on that. With that being said, I want to sincerely thank you for your time, and I'll turn the time back over to Billy for some closing remarks in the Q&A.
Thanks, Reagan. I do want to, enter into a Q&A period. Obviously, you can see Reagan's contact information up there. But before we do that, we just wanted to give those on the call an opportunity to learn more about SageWorks ALLL solution and how it can help with your backtesting efforts. So we put a poll question up here. Obviously, we wanted to keep today's session very content-oriented and not make it, any kind of commercial or anything like that. So did want to go ahead and put this up on the screen. We've seen a lot of momentum with our ALLL solution this year and how it can help prepare for the FASB changes in terms of getting the loan level data archived, and then also here we go, how it can help with backtesting your ALLL methodology. So we've got roughly 30% of you have already voted, so we'll leave it open for another few seconds here to give those on the call an opportunity to indicate their preference. And again, while you're doing this, is a fantastic opportunity to enter in some questions. I've seen some great ones come in, some that we'll address on the call, and some that we'll follow up with you individually next week, or even possibly this afternoon. So I encourage you to keep entering those in. We'll go ahead and close down this poll question now. So as I said, on the screen, Reagan, if you want to put up the final slide there so we have your contact information. We'll go ahead and enter into the Q&A portion of today's presentation. So I did see one question that came in. Reagan, you mentioned the FASB CECL model briefly a few different times. We had a question about when the thought is of when that would actually come out. We've seen some different things, saying that maybe it'll get released this year with implementation, a few years down the line. But any insight on that, or is it still kind of a guessing game?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny anytime we do, and I think this question is evidence to the fact that this is one thing that's on the forefront of everybody's mind. As much as I try to limit my emphasis on it, but a really good question. The short answer is the general consensus is that the final proposal will come out this year. That's coming from several credible sources. The AICPA conference, they recently advised that it looks like FASB and the IASB are looking at reconverging. They're wanting to put together a joint proposal. Whether that happens or not, I don't know. But there is a heavy push to have that out this year. Now, with that being said, just because there's going to be a final proposal that hopefully will come out this year, you probably, if history sets any precedents, that probably still gives you, depending on if you're a public or private institution as well as your institution size, probably still gives you at least 12 months before actual implementation, would be my guess. It may be as much as 24 months or so. The reality is that it's going to require a lot of data. So if you're concerned about it, make sure that you're preparing now. Don't just sit back and be reactive to those changes. Start making, even though we don't know what the final proposal will be, we at least have an idea of the direction they're going. So there are things from a data collection standpoint and others that we can start doing today in order to take a proactive approach to where we have the flexibility to be reactive when the final standard comes out. So I would expect it to come out this year. I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't, but that is my expectation, and I would expect in the next couple years for that to be implemented. But again, encourage you to start looking at that now.
Thanks, Reagan. I did have a few other questions that we wanted to address, and appreciate those that are inserting those into the questions box on the GoToWebinar panel. Reagan, you got into the environmental adjustments, the qualitative adjustments needing to be directionally consistent and that sort of thing. Can you give a little more detail on being directionally consistent and what that means?
Yeah, just again, qualitative adjustments. We need to, in order to monitor that, one of the key things I think is to make sure that we have defined drivers behind each of our factors. So if we're looking at concentrations of credit and changes in that, let's make sure that we identify or define what metrics we're going to look at and be consistent in identifying those metrics, but also the source that we're getting the data from. So in the presentation I mentioned unemployment rate. You don't want to always grab it from different sources if you're looking at unemployment, because each source may have different information. So one, make sure that we have our metrics defined so that we're consistent, but also make sure that if unemployment rate, if that's one of our underlying drivers, if that goes up, consequently we would expect risk to go up. And consequently, we would expect, we would want our qualitative factor to increase as well. So that's what we mean by directionally consistent. Is it consistent with the movement of the underlying or associated key metrics or drivers?
Great, thanks, Reagan. We're approaching 1 hour here, so we're just going to leave it with one final question for you, Reagan. We talked about backtesting. How often do you recommend that we backtest the ALLL?
Yeah, really good question. And the short answer is it depends. I recommend you doing it as often as is feasible for you. We see institutions, and I think we saw that in that first poll, that there are some institutions who are doing it monthly. If you're doing that, terrific. The more times if you have the resources to do that, the more in line you can keep it. The problem is that if we're only doing it annually, what happens is we start to get off track, and sometimes it's too little, too late, where we're now having to go back and react to it. Whereas if it's not going to veer too far off if we're constantly bringing it back in line with where we need to be. So the more, as often as you can do it, great. You probably don't need to do it more than monthly. Truthfully, for most institutions, who are your community banks, once a quarter is probably sufficient if you have the resources to do it. Annually is great if that's all you have the resources to do, but I would encourage you to do it as often as possible. But generally, I would say probably once a quarter is the safest bet.
Great. Thanks, Reagan. And with that being said, just wanted to quickly highlight the resources once again. Encourage you to join us on LinkedIn, on the ALLL Forum for Bankers, on Twitter at SageWorks Banker. And then certainly feel free to visit our website, sageworksanalyst.com, where you can find a variety of white papers and other archived webinars, including some on the FASB CECL model. And then as a reminder, you will receive an email later today with a link to the recording of today's presentation as well as slides so you can go back and review certain components, and feel free to share with others in your institution who are not on the call. And then finally, just a quick reminder about the 3rd Annual Risk Management Summit just recently announced. Encourage you to go ahead and check that out and get registered early to take advantage of the early bird savings. So with that being said, I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this Friday afternoon, and hope everyone has a terrific weekend. Thank you again.
The organizer